You're lying on cold stone in total darkness beneath the greatest killing floor ever constructed. 60,000 Romans just scream themselves hoarse watching your husband bleed out on the sand above. Now they're filing out to their dinners, their baths, their beds. You can still smell him, iron and sweat seeping through the grates. The torches are dying one by one, gates are grinding shut somewhere in the maze around you, and then you hear it. Boots. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. A shadow fills the archway. Keys rattle, the lock gives way. Standing in front of you is the man who just drove a sword through your husband's chest. This isn't fiction. This isn't dramatized. This was an ordinary Tuesday in ancient Rome. The Colosseum wasn't just a stadium. It was the shiny surface of something far darker. A sprawling underground industry of human trafficking that kept grinding long after the crowds went home. Beneath those marble seats below the blood-soaked arena floor, Rome operated a silent empire of flesh. A bureaucratic machine that catalogued people like livestock. Historians have a term for one piece of it, Victoria Carnalis, because the Romans never bothered naming what they considered completely routine. We're about to descend into that underworld. You'll see how captured women became line items on a ledger, how champion fighters collected their prizes, how the same empire that engineered roads and running water also perfected systematic horror in the tunnels beneath the cheering masses. By the time we surface, everything you thought you knew about gladiators, about Rome, about civilization itself will be shattered. But before we step into those corridors, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. To understand what that woman was about to endure, you need to see how Rome treated victory itself. When legions crushed a rebellion, they didn't just claim territory. They harvested people with the same cold efficiency they used for gold or timber. A conquered city wasn't a tragedy, it was a delivery. Soldiers sorted survivors like cargo, dividing them into categories based on a single question. What can we extract from this body? Men who could still swing a sword faced two paths, both brutal. Some were shipped to quarries and mines, worked until they collapsed. Others were fed to the arena, thrown against beasts, or molded into gladiators. Children vanished into slave markets stretching from Hispania to Syria, and the women received their own classification, captiva, spoils of war owned by the state. From that moment, their futures were decided not by their own will, but by ink on parchment. Roman law made this machinery run smoothly. Under their legal code, a conquered enemy who had been enslaved ceased to exist as a full human being. Slaves were filed under the same category as tools and animals. The Latin word was res things objects. A table had no rights, neither did a captive woman. If her owner starved her, brutalized her, violated her, it wasn't a crime in any sense we would recognize. At worst, it was property damage, a financial inconvenience for the owner. The victim's suffering was legally invisible, but law alone couldn't hold an empire together. Rome needed spectacle. The games weren't entertainment, they were education. When you sat in those stands, watching a prisoner ripped apart by wild animals, you were receiving a lesson in what happened to anyone who defied Roman power. Fear made visible, packaged with music, food vendors, and thunderous applause. A typical day at a major amphitheater followed a reliable schedule. Morning brought animal hunts and exotic beast battles. Midday was reserved for executions. Afternoon featured the headline gladiator matches. That midday slot, when wealthy Romans often stepped out for lunch or political conversations, was frequently the most depraved. This was the hour of what historians now call fatal charades. These were theatrical productions based on famous myths and legends, except there were no actors who would take a bow afterward. Condemned prisoners were costumed as legendary figures from stories every Roman knew by heart. Their deaths became live performances. The audience got a familiar narrative with one crucial difference. The blood was genuine. The poet Martial, writing in the 1st century AD, describes these spectacles with unsettling casualness. He wasn't exposing atrocities, he was reviewing entertainment. In one passage, he recounts a man forced to play Orpheus, the mythical musician whose melodies could tame any creature. The prisoner walked onto the sand carrying a lyre. He never got the chance to play a single note. A bear was released. It tore him to pieces while spectators munched on snacks and roared for more. Martial quips that this time the magic failed. For him, a clever observation. For the prisoner, his final moment of existence. Another scene Martial documents is far worse. The entire spectacle was staged around the twisted ancient pagan myth of Pasiphae, a queen who, according to the dark legends of the time, fell into deep perversion and actually coupled with a sacred bull. But the Romans, operating under that same spirit of Babylon, we see rising again today didn't just leave it as a story. They transformed it into a live demonic exhibition where a condemned woman was prepared, dragged into the arena, and positioned specifically so that a wild animal could be driven onto her. We need to be very clear that there were absolutely no illusions, no special effects, and no substitutes involved in this ritual. The massive audience sat there consumed by a bloodthirsty spirit, watching a real human being get brutally assaulted by a real beast. She would die from those horrific injuries right in front of everyone, and that public sacrifice was precisely the point of the event. This wasn't an accident or some malfunction in the program, it was advertised weeks in advance, and this detail matters because it reveals the premeditated evil of the system. The Roman state, the iron legs of prophecy, didn't try to conceal this violence from the public. On the contrary, the government actively promoted it as entertainment. They had announcements painted in bold letters on the city walls, promising the spectators exactly what kind of demonic horrors and bloodshed they could expect to witness. You had senators, wealthy merchants, aristocrats, and their entire families arriving with full knowledge that they were about to watch people get burned alive, torn apart, humiliated, and destroyed in these dark symbolic ways. And the most disturbing part is that some of them brought their children. While the condemned souls were shrieking in agony, vendors were casually weaving through the rows, selling refreshments completely desensitized to the slaughter taking place inches away. Understand that this wasn't just one deranged emperor losing his mind. This was established public policy that continued for generations under different rulers because the government funded it. Government officials coordinated the logistics, and ancient writers like Martial and Juvenal described these events without a single trace of shock, proving how seared their consciences had become. This was exactly how the empire conditioned its citizens, just like the programming we see in 2026, to view conquered peoples and the oppressed as subhuman entities. Once you could sit there and watch a man dressed as Orpheus die just for laughs, it became much easier for the society to accept that a captive woman held somewhere beneath that same arena was just another prize to be used. She was viewed as nothing more than another piece of equipment, a commodity distributed as a reward for a job well done in the service of the beast system. Now let's bring the gladiators back into focus, because these men existed inside a strange contradiction that parallels the struggle we see in the Black Awakening today. Legally speaking, most of these men were slaves. Some were criminals sentenced to the games, while others were prisoners of war captured from foreign lands. Only a handful were volunteers chasing money or glory, but whatever their origin, once they entered those training schools, they became absolute property of the state. Their bodies belonged entirely to their owner, usually a wealthy manager called a lanista, or at the highest levels of the cabal, the emperor himself. Yet these gladiators achieved a kind of fame and celebrity status that free citizens could only fantasize about, similar to how modern athletes are worshipped while still being owned by the system. Their faces appeared in intricate mosaics and graffiti all over the city. Fans scratched their names into walls, and in cities like Pompeii, scrolled messages still celebrate specific fighters. One fighter is referred to as the heartthrob of the girls, while another is called the glory of the women, showing the intense idolatry of the time. Young men imitated their style, and swagger children played games pretending to be them, and women from elite families were especially captivated by this forbidden strength. Ancient writers often joke with bitter undertones about noble ladies bribing the guards to sneak into the gladiator barracks after dark to engage in illicit affairs. Stories circulated widely about fighters like Sergius, a heavily scarred warrior who became the object of desire for the elite. He became the secret lover of multiple married aristocrats and sparked massive scandals that spread through every dinner party in the high society of Rome. It got so deep that even gladiator sweat became a commodity. After the fights, attendants would scrape the oil grime and perspiration right off their skin. That mixture was actually bottled up and sold to the public as a beauty treatment and a potent love potion, which is pure witchcraft. Wealthy women purchased it believing that some trace of the gladiators' power and magnetism would supernaturally transfer to them. So Rome had manufactured something extremely dangerous. They created a population of trained killers who knew each other intimately, lived in close quarters, were worshipped by segments of the public, and were absolutely furious at their oppression. Many of them had been captured from their homelands, enslaved or condemned by the very state that now paraded them for sport. The danger wasn't hypothetical at all. It was a prophetic ticking time bomb waiting to explode against the ruling class. In 73 BC, at a training school in Capua, roughly 70 gladiators finally broke out. Led by a man history remembers as Spartacus, they armed themselves and fled the plantation. What started as a simple jailbreak erupted into a full-scale war as thousands of escaped slaves and desperate peasants recognized the awakening and joined them. At the peak of this uprising, the rebel army may have numbered 70,000 fighters ready to take down the system. They defeated the elite Roman forces repeatedly, and for nearly 2 years, the mighty power of Rome couldn't stop them. When the rebellion was finally crushed, the retaliation from the state was designed to echo through centuries as a warning to anyone else who dared to wake up. Approximately 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, which was the main highway leading into Rome, and the crosses stretched for miles. Ancient sources claim there was a body every few dozen paces, transforming the road into a corridor of slow public death. And that image burned itself into the Roman psyche for generations. It served as both a warning and a deep societal wound. From that moment on, every gladiator holding a weapon looked like a potential Spartacus to the fearful elite. Rome knew it couldn't afford carelessness anymore, but the economy depended on these games, so they couldn't simply release the captives. So the empire deployed incentives offering better food, improved living conditions, and prize money after successful fights to keep them pacified. Sometimes they even offered the promise of a wooden sword, the symbol that a gladiator had earned complete freedom after surviving enough bouts in the arena. And there was something else rarely spoken of directly, but threaded through the entire corrupt system: access to captive women as a way to control the men. The written evidence for this isn't spelled out in a single manual because Roman authors rarely explain the mechanics of their sin in one place. But when you align fragments from Martial Juvenal later commentators and legal texts, an undeniable pattern of systemic exploitation emerges. After major games, especially those sponsored by emperors or ambitious politicians, eager to dazzle the crowds, victorious gladiators were said to receive the privileges of the victor. The phrase is deliberately vague. Modern historians believe one of those privileges was the right to use women held beneath the arena. From the state's perspective, this solved multiple problems simultaneously. It rewarded fighters without granting them real power or independence. It cost almost nothing because the captives were already there, already classified as spoils of war. And it reinforced Rome's foundational message about conquest. When you win, you gain bodies. You gain access. You gain the right to do whatever you want with people who have been officially demoted to objects. Now return to that single woman in a dark cell beneath the arena. She had already been processed through Rome's machinery. Soldiers had dragged her from her home months or even years earlier. Some official had scratched her name or an approximation of it into a ledger. Her origin was noted from Gaul, from Britannia, from Judea, from some tribe the Romans couldn't be bothered to spell correctly. She was counted, grouped, transported with other captives. She was part of a shipment. Some women from that shipment ended up in private households as servants or concubines. Others were auctioned in city squares, but a specific portion was sent to places like the Colosseum. Not to stand in the sunlight before cheering crowds, but to wait in stone rooms below, classified as state property attached to the games. They were housed, fed just enough to remain alive, and kept ready for use whenever officials decided. On the day her husband died, she may have been permitted to see him one final time. Or she may have heard his screams without knowing which voice was his. Either way, once his body was dragged off and the sand was raked for the next fight, her fate remained undecided. She wasn't a person under Roman law, she was a resource managed by arena bureaucracy. So, when those footsteps stopped outside her cell and the key turned, it wasn't random. Somewhere a clerk had scratched a note onto a tablet. A gladiator's name, a mark beside a number representing a captive. A match had been made. The man in the doorway had just given Rome what it wanted on the sand above. Now Rome was giving him what it believed he deserved below. The crowd was dispersing. Torches in the stands were dying, but beneath the arena, the night was only beginning. The gladiator turned toward the stairs, descending deeper into the underground corridors toward the chambers designed for what came next. In the next part, we're going down there with him into the Hypogeum, where the stones, the chains, and the graffiti still carry the marks of what happened when the games ended. The stairs leading into the Hypogeum were steep and cramped by design. There was only one direction that mattered: down. Oil lamps flickered along the walls, casting weak pools of light that barely touched the darkness between them. The air was dense with the stench of animal waste, human sweat, and iron. Somewhere in the blackness, a lion slammed against its cage, and the metal screamed. Above the crowd was a distant rumble, like thunder filtering through stone. Down here, the roar of the arena served only as a reminder that the city's attention was fixed elsewhere. No one was watching what happened in these corridors. The gladiator moved forward with a guard at his back and an arena official leading the way. The official carried a wax tablet and a stylus. That small block of wood and wax held more power down here than any blade. It contained names, numbers, and marks that transformed living human beings into entries on a list. A tick beside one line might mean sent to the mines. Another mark might mean pushed onto the arena floor. Today, one of those marks meant delivered to the victor. This entire underground level, the Hypogeum, was a triumph of Roman engineering. It was also a triumph of control. Service corridors snaked between animal handler stations. Storage chambers held props and machinery. Holding pens caged beasts imported from Africa and the East. Waiting rooms held condemned prisoners who would be lifted on platforms to face quick deaths in the sunlight. And then there were the other rooms, the ones archaeologists struggled to explain at first. These chambers were small, rarely larger than a modern bedroom, 10 to 15 square meters. They sat apart from the main traffic routes, isolated from the chaos surrounding the animal cages, and the lifts that carried scenery to the arena floor. When you examine the layouts of multiple amphitheaters, Capua, Pompeii, Pozzuoli, and the Colosseum itself, you see the same pattern repeated. A cluster of rooms with no clear logistical purpose for the games themselves. No ramps for animals, no wide spaces for storing equipment, just isolated cells. Inside the features are chillingly consistent. Narrow stone benches constructed at a very specific height. These chambers were never designed for rest or rehabilitation. They are far too narrow, suffocatingly tight, and harder than the hearts of the oppressors who built them. We are looking at iron rings driven deep into the stone walls, reminiscent of the yokes of iron prophesied in the scriptures. And understand, family, we are not talking about one or two solitary rings. There are several of them positioned strategically anchored near the floor at waist level and up at shoulder height. In some of these dungeon rooms, the iron chains aren't just rusted debris left behind by time. They are structurally anchored into the very foundation of the building, an integral part of the original blueprint of this beast system. The doors are massive, reinforced with heavy metal plating, designed to keep the truth hidden and the captives without hope. Notice the design. They lock exclusively from the outside, proving that control was absolute. These weren't temporary holding cells or quick cages used right before a public execution or a show trial. These spaces were not workshops for craftsmanship, and they certainly weren't pens for livestock, though the empire treated people worse than cattle. The olfactory evidence and the distinct scratch patterns on the stone tell a much darker story than simple animal husbandry. They appear exactly as the ancient suppressed texts have hinted at for centuries. These were torture spaces specifically engineered to keep human beings restrained in whatever agonizing position a guard or overseer decided upon for as long as they deemed necessary. The women who found themselves shackled in these cells had already been ground down by the iron teeth of Rome's bureaucracy long before they ever set foot in the arena's shadow. You have to understand the system. After a conquest, the imperial officials, the scribes and accountants of the day, would record the captured people in detailed ledgers, much like modern-day booking numbers. They documented everything with cold precision: how many were taken, where they were stolen from, and what physical condition they were in. Every single woman received a ledger entry, reducing a living soul to a line item. She might be listed simply by her region: Germanic, Britannic, Judean, or Parthian, or even more dehumanizing, reduced strictly to a batch number. Her true name, her lineage, and her history were often mangled or completely erased from the record. To the state, her identity meant nothing. Her origin, her age, and her physical utility were the only metrics that mattered to the powers that be. On the official paperwork, she was stamped as captiva, a war captive. But in practice, looking at the spiritual reality, that title meant she was the absolute property of the Roman state, which could lease, sell, or trade her however it saw fit to maintain its dominance. Some of these souls were shipped off to massive estates to work the land until they dropped dead, fueling the agricultural economy of the empire. Others were sold in the open markets, like produce, but a specific chosen percentage were attached to the great urban spectacles. They became the invisible infrastructure of the games, the hidden labor force that no one in the Colosseum dared to speak about. They were simply listed among the assets right next to the bricks, the mortar, and the weaponry. So when a gladiator performed well and entertained the bloodthirsty masses and the sponsor of the games wanted to show off his wealth and generosity, the reward system was already set up and waiting. The same wicked administrators who placed orders for exotic beasts from Africa and Asia could just as easily put in a requisition order for more human captives to be delivered. The very same accounting tablets that tracked how many leopards or lions were left for the afternoon slaughter also kept a running tally of how many women were available in the dark cells below the stadium. When the fighting was over, the gladiator didn't always go back to the barracks to rest and recover his strength immediately. Sometimes while he was still strapped in his armor, still dripping with the sweat and blood of the arena, he was guided down a different, darker corridor away from the public eye. The official holding the tablet would walk ahead of him, squinting at lines of text by the flickering light of an oil lamp, checking the inventory of human misery. Right behind him, the guard kept his hand hovering near his weapon because no matter how much praise this gladiator had just received, he was still a trained killer walking through a confined space. They would arrive at a row of heavy doors. Behind each one of those reinforced barriers sat one or more captives waiting in terror for the lock to turn. Some ancient references suggest a twisted hierarchy where a successful fighter might be allowed to choose his prize. Perhaps the doors were swung open one by one, faces revealed for a split second in the gloom and then slammed shut again. Other historical hints imply that the choice was made for him entirely handed out, like a ration of bread or a new piece of equipment issued from the supply room. Either way, the decision had already been logged in the books. The guard would stop at a specifically marked door, produce a heavy iron key, and the sound of metal sliding into metal would echo through the hall. In some instances, a woman was dragged out into the corridor, her chain clipped to one of those rings in the hallway. We mentioned earlier treated with less dignity than a dog. The gladiator was told she was his property for the night or the hour, or however long the unwritten rules of this wicked society permitted. In other scenarios, he was simply shoved inside the cell and the door was locked tight behind him. The walls were closing in on them. The air was thick and stale. The roar of the crowd and the noise from the arena above had faded into a terrifying silence. Now, the Roman authors and historians never provide a clear description of the atrocities that happen next in these rooms. They don't walk us through the details because they lack the moral compass to care. They didn't need to write it down. For them, in their debased state of mind, the situation required no explanation whatsoever. It was simply a slave man being rewarded with a captive woman who was defined by law as property. In a society where enslaved people had zero legal protection against sexual exploitation, the vile privileges of victory didn't need to be spelled out in the history books. The architecture itself fills the silence left by the texts, the rings set at different heights. The stone benches placed with cruel precision and the frantic scratches etched into the rock around the restraints tell the whole story. From the perspective of the state and the government, none of this constituted a crime. It wasn't even a topic of controversy or debate. There was no legal category for the rape of a slave, as we understand the concept of justice today. The system was designed to protect the owner, not the owned. The jurists and lawyers of the time discussed it only in terms of damage to property, loss of monetary value, or the unauthorized use of another man's possession. But when the state itself owned the captives and assigned them as rewards for service, even that weak, superficial protection evaporated completely into thin air. The entire process was simply viewed as another line item in the game's operating costs. You have to consider the cold, demonic efficiency of that arrangement. The government would conquer a region, capture its people, process them through the system, and then use the bodies of the women to motivate the fighters to deliver more violent performances. It didn't require extra funding from the treasury. It didn't require opening a new administrative office. It was self-sustaining evil. It just added another line to the list of benefits that kept the gladiators obedient and willing to kill for the empire. They gave them food prize money, the tantalizing chance at freedom someday, and the right to do whatever they wanted to human beings who had already been marked by the system as less than human. One later writer summarizing these older accounts reduced the logic of this beast system to a single brutal sentence that sums up the mindset of the time. The victor takes his prize just as the empire takes its provinces by conquest and force with absolutely no need to ask for permission. That was how Rome saw it, and that spirit is still alive today. In the ancient world, and specifically within the iron grip of the Roman Empire power, was its own religion, its own justification for every atrocity committed under the sun. If you emerged victorious, the system declared you righteous. If you were conquered, you became living proof that the gods had forsaken you, marking you as prey for the strong. For centuries, the gatekeepers of history, the academics and the scholars, focused their attention almost exclusively on the sanitized written accounts of the games, ignoring the blood that cried out from the ground. They pored over the works of the poets, the moralists, and the legal texts, dissecting the surface-level laws, while the dark underground chambers were merely noted as footnotes, their true sinister purpose remaining shrouded in mystery and willful ignorance. However, as excavations beneath these massive amphitheaters continued through the 19th and 20th centuries, the earth began to vomit up the truth, revealing extra rooms that kept appearing with disturbing regularity and similar terrifying features. There were simply too many of these chambers to ignore, and their design was far too specific to be dismissed as random storage units for grain or oil. This was architectural evidence of systematic iniquity. In the city of Rome, deep beneath the Colosseum, the very belly of the beast, archaeologists mapped out a labyrinth of corridors and chambers that reveal the true spiritual darkness of the empire. To this day, the tour guides will distract you with stories of lions and tigers, pointing out the animal cages and the intricate mechanisms that lifted scenery and fighters through trap doors to dazzle the masses. But if you look at the detailed blueprints, the things they don't show you on the brochure, you can see tightly enclosed spaces designed with that same chilling pattern of stone benches and iron rings bolted into the rock. These chambers sit off to the side, hidden away from the main traffic of the arena floor, secluded in the shadows, where the roar of the crowd was just a muffled vibration in the ceiling. Some of these rooms show heavy, distinct wear around the anchoring points in the walls, as if heavy chains had been pulled, twisted and yanked there over and over again by desperate root. In Capua, the very city where the gladiator Spartacus launched his revolt against the slave masters, the findings are even more haunting and speak volumes about the spirit of oppression that permeated the land. In the Hypogeum, the underground network of the amphitheater, excavators discovered cell walls scratched with frantic writing. Not the neat carved inscriptions of the victors you see on triumphal arches, but the raw testimony of the vanquished. These were rough, jagged marks made by trembling hands, without proper tools, likely carved with loose stones or fingernails, and written by souls who knew they had very little time left on this earth. Some of the markings are just erratic lines and shapes. Perhaps a prisoner counting down the days until their execution, while others form jagged words, though not all the graffiti is legible after 2,000 years of silence. Some of the writing is in broken Latin, the language of the oppressor, while other scripts are in Celtic or local tongues. But a few messages stand out with piercing clarity, like one that translates roughly to "I was Amelia of the Brigantes." Her message continues a cry from the dust. "I saw my children killed. Now I am nothing." Another reads with heartbreaking finality, "To any god who hears, let me die before tomorrow." These are not the polished voices of senators, generals, or the elite philosophers who debated ethics while sitting on soft cushions. These voices are not part of Rome's celebrated literature or their high society. Their words didn't survive because some scribe thought they mattered or because they had status. They survived because stone is hard to erase, and the Most High ensures that the testimony of the wicked is preserved for judgment. Those desperate lines were scratched by someone with just enough strength left to press their pain into the rock, and enough to spare to use that final ounce of energy on words instead of a futile attempt to escape the beast system. These inscriptions tell us that the captives understood exactly how the system viewed them. They were fully aware they were trapped in a machine that consumed human souls for sport. They knew they had been stripped of their identities, reduced from mother, daughter, or wife to a subhuman status that didn't even qualify for the basic protections of the law or common decency. Notice that their appeal isn't to the emperor, the Senate, or to Roman justice, because they knew those institutions were corrupt. Their cry is to any god at all, any power beyond the reach of Rome that might be listening to their anguish. The Roman historians, much like the media of today, barely mention people like Amelia. They prefer to write about the glory of emperors, the strategy of military campaigns, and the juicy details of political scandals. They sit back and admire, criticize, or mock the games, engaging in intellectual debates about whether the bloodshed makes the citizens tougher or weaker, completely missing the spiritual rot at the core. But they don't waste sentences on the women weeping in the underground chambers. Because in their worldview, those lives hold no value. They are simply fuel for the fire. For the historians and the masses, those women are just part of the scenery, indistinguishable from the sand on the arena floor or the iron bars of the cages. However, one historian, Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century Anno Domini, offers a single unintentional clue when he mentions that beneath the major arenas there were designated places for those who awaited their use. It is a strange and terrifying phrase, their use. Used by whom, used for what purpose, Dio doesn't elaborate, likely because the depravity was so normalized he didn't feel the need to explain it. In his mind, the phrase is clear enough to his contemporaries, but from our perspective, in 2026, combined with the physical evidence, it sounds like a window into a satanic system that Roman elites took for granted. This evidence exposes a society that never bothered to explain its own wickedness, because it had seared its conscience with a hot iron, accepting the unacceptable as standard procedure. The most disturbing aspect of all this is that nothing about this setup appears temporary or accidental. It wasn't a glitch in the Matrix, it was a feature of the program. These rooms weren't hasty modifications built for one mad emperor's private amusement. They were integrated into the stone architecture from the very beginning, baked into the foundation of these monuments to pride. That means architects and planners sat at tables, drew lines on wax tablets or parchments, and approved government budgets that included not just animal cages and weapon racks, but also specific restraint points and narrow benches in isolated rape cells. They invested the empire's wealth in making sure this cycle of abuse could happen again and again efficiently, without interrupting the flow of the entertainment upstairs. This was a cold, calculated repetition, not an exception. It was a well-oiled machine of degradation, not a sudden crime of passion committed in the heat of the moment. Once you grasp that reality, the image of the gladiator standing in the doorway and the woman trembling on the bench shifts entirely. He isn't a monster operating outside the system on some deviant impulse. He is a moving part inside the mechanism of the beast, doing exactly what Rome expected him to do, taking the reward the system told him he had earned through violence. But this raises a question the Romans almost never asked aloud, and one that modern America rarely asks as we consume our own forms of violent entertainment. What did this ritualistic trauma do to the men involved, to the fighters whose lives became a never-ending cycle of violence, above the ground and depravity below the arena floor? What happened to the souls of the guards who held the keys, or the officials whose job was to tally up the numbers while pretending those numbers weren't human beings made by the Creator? In the next part of this series, we're going to examine the severe psychological and spiritual cost of this practice known as Victoria Carnalis. We will look at the way some Romans tried to justify this evil through philosophy and law, and the divine forces that finally brought this entire bloody industry to a total collapse. And we will confront the hardest question of all, looking squarely into the mirror of our own time. How different are we really from the crowd that walked past those underground doors and chose not to care what was happening behind them? As we move further into 2026 with the veil being lifted on so much darkness picture, what happens after that door closes? And ask yourself, what happens when it opens again? The parallels between the ancient Roman amphitheater and the modern world are undeniable, proving that while the technology changes, the spirit of Babylon remains exactly the same. The warrior stumbles back into the shadows of the corridor, his armor hanging loose, weighing heavy on a spirit that's already fractured. His chest heaves, gasping for air that feels thick with judgment. A gatekeeper slams the iron bars shut behind him, click, lock, seal, without even looking him in the eye. To the elites running this beast system, nothing significant just happened. It's just business as usual in Babylon. On a stone tablet somewhere, a box gets checked off. Inventory managed. A demonic transaction completed. The machine has finished another cycle of consuming a human soul. And what about the sister left behind in the dark? She remains on that cold bench or the dirt floor, staring at the wall, dissociated from the reality of her oppression. You won't see her story in the history books of the conquerors. They don't build statues for the victims of the empire. But let me tell you, without breaking people like her, Rome's entire counterfeit kingdom of glory and power would collapse overnight. For the fighter, this nightmare is just part of the rhythm of his bondage. His whole life is engineered chaos, built on controlled explosions of violence to keep the masses distracted. Upstairs in the arena, he deals death or nearly dies, while 50,000 possessed souls scream his name, worshipping the idol of bloodshed. In the barracks, he trains, he bleeds, and he heals just enough to do it again. Down in the dungeons, the system lies to him, telling him this carnal sin is his reward. Wake up and see the game. He is a slave, permitted to feel like a king for a singular hour. The system uses that false sense of power to keep him from directing his righteous rage upward at the Caesars who actually own him. There were men back then who swallowed this lie whole, never questioning the matrix they were born into. They were raised in a world where war, human trafficking, and abuse were just the standard tools of the state, ordinary instruments of power in a fallen world. But others, especially the prisoners of war, dragged into these gladiator schools, must have felt the spiritual warfare tearing them apart from the inside out. One day they were free men, the next they were turned into weapons of mass destruction against their own brothers. We don't have their journals because the victors erased the evidence of their psychological crimes. But we know from the testimony of slaves throughout history that forcing a captive to harm another captive is the devil's oldest trick to keep the people fractured, divided, and conquered. Even some of the pagan voices noticed something was deeply demonic about the whole setup. The philosopher Seneca, writing in the 1st century, describes walking into the arena during the midday executions. He goes in expecting routine justice or simple punishment. Instead, he witnesses what he calls pure murder. No skill, no honor, just human beings being slaughtered in creative ways while the crowd laughs like hyenas. He leaves feeling filthy. He writes that watching such cruelty opens a door in the spirit, making people worse, teaching them to enjoy pain and forget that the victims are made in the image of God. Seneca doesn't talk about the Victoria Carnalis specifically. Almost nobody exposes the deepest sins of the elite. But his complaint strikes at the root of the tree. These games weren't just neutral entertainment, they were mass programming. They were training citizens to view certain lives as disposable, training them to look at a person in agony and feel a rush of dopamine instead of horror. Once you have conditioned a population to accept that level of evil, adding sexual violence to the system isn't a dramatic leap. It is the inevitable next step in a reprobate society. Other writers attacked the games from different angles, exposing the rot in high society. Juvenal the satirist mocks the upper-class women who were obsessed with these gladiators. He describes a noblewoman abandoning her husband to run off with a fighter drawn to his scars and his fame. He is ridiculing her, but he's revealing a dark truth. The cult of the celebrity gladiator had infiltrated every level of respectable society. These men, officially at the bottom of the legal order, became objects of lust and idolatry for the people at the top. That tension gave Rome a thrill, but it also gave them fear. The early Christian writers, however, went much deeper than social critique. Tertullian in the 2nd and 3rd centuries commanded true believers to boycott the arena entirely. He declared these spectacles were soaked in blood and dedicated to demons, insisting that you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and watch the cup of devils without corrupting your soul. Later on, figures like Augustine remembered how addictive the spirit of violence could be. Augustine tells a story about a friend who refused to watch, was dragged there by peer pressure, tried to keep his eyes closed, but then heard the roar of the crowd, a demonic frequency, and when he looked, he was instantly hooked. The violence pulled him in like a magnet. He became someone who craved more death, more blood. These writers don't need to describe the Victoria Carnalis in detail. They condemn the entire satanic structure that made such abominations possible. They describe the games as a dark altar where lust and blood mingled, where the elites and the commoners gathered to watch human beings stripped, exposed, humiliated, and destroyed. Adding state-controlled sexual access too, the underground level of that building doesn't break the logic of the empire. It completes it. And what did this system do to the guards who held the keys? What about the clerks who filed the paperwork, or the crowd walking over those underground chambers without ever wondering what kind of hell lay directly beneath their feet? Most Romans never looked in the mirror and saw a monster. They would have told you they were just following tradition, enjoying public entertainment, fulfilling their roles in society. The true horror lives in that normality. The more routine the system became, the less anyone felt responsible for the evil they were participating in. It's the banality of evil. For centuries, this machine of conquest, spectacle, and carnal victory operated with few serious interruptions, grinding humans into dust. Emperors rose and fell. Some were open sadists, others showed more restraint. A few, like Marcus Aurelius, pretended to be moral philosophers while the blood flowed. Yet under nearly all of them, the games continued. The spirit of Rome never stopped its consumption. The Colosseum and other arenas kept filling up. The captives kept being processed. The gladiators kept fighting. And that same spirit is alive and well in 2026. Deep within the bowels of that wicked infrastructure, gates were continually swinging open and shutting tight, echoing like the heartbeat of a dying giant. So how did the curtain finally fall on this demonic show of horrors? It did not end because of a single piece of legislation, nor did it vanish in one clean, decisive moment of clarity. The utter dismantling of this beastly industry happened gradually, chipping away at the foundation from every conceivable angle until it collapsed. First and foremost, we have to look at the finances, because the love of money has always been the fuel for the fires of Babylon. Organizing these gladiatorial blood rituals was a financial burden of astronomical proportions, costing sums that would bankrupt even the wealthiest modern nations. Think about the logistics involved. You had to purchase or hunt down exotic beasts from the four corners of the earth, keep them fed, train them to kill, engineer, and maintain complex death traps, pay off the handlers, house the warriors, and employ a massive staff just to keep the machine running. By the time we reached the 3rd century AD, the judgment of history began to strike the Roman Empire with repeated devastating blows. They faced civil wars, foreign invasions, pestilence, and a runaway inflation that looked suspiciously like the economic shaking we are witnessing right now in the year 2026. Emperors were rising and falling with such chaotic speed that the common people joked that the real power lay with the military, not the puppet on the throne. In that unstable environment, even the elite oligarchs hesitated to pour their fortunes into financing these massive blood-soaked games. Consequently, the sheer scale of the operation began to contract as the money dried up. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, there was a seismic shift in the spiritual atmosphere of the culture. As the teachings of Christianity began to permeate the empire, especially spreading among the city dwellers, and the downtrodden, a growing number of people began to see the arena not as entertainment, but as something morally repugnant and spiritually dark. Now understand this, not everyone agreed with this awakening. There were still plenty of citizens and rulers who were drunk on the wine of violence and loved the spectacle of death. However, the revelation that human life carried a sacred divine value began to clash violently with the ancient pagan belief that conquered bodies were merely tools to be used and discarded. The so-called Christian emperors found themselves trapped in a massive contradiction. They desperately wanted to position themselves as defenders of a faith that preached mercy and love. Yet they were simultaneously using these satanic games to project their dominance and keep the restless masses under a spell of distraction. Some of these leaders tried to walk a middle path, attempting a lukewarm compromise between righteousness and political expediency. For instance, Emperor Constantine, back in the early 4th century, issued decrees that limited the use of certain convicted criminals in the arena, encouraging officials to send them to the labor mines instead of the slaughterhouse. Later rulers would echo these sentiments, issuing bans on the gladiator training schools, but the enforcement was weak and inconsistent, much like the political theater we see in our own government today. Local governors and the bloodthirsty citizenry often pushed back hard. They were addicted to the spectacle and refused to surrender their favorite form of demonic entertainment. Yet by the time we arrived at the early 5th century, the spiritual and social pressure had intensified to a breaking point. There is a famous account, perhaps blurring the lines between recorded history and legend, that tells of a monk named Telemachus or Timachus. According to the stories passed down through the ages, he traveled all the way to Rome, walked into the stadium, and upon witnessing the carnage, leaped into the arena to beg the crowd to stop the sin. In response, the mob stoned the prophet to death. When the news of this martyrdom reached Emperor Honorius, the accounts claim he was so shaken by the horror of it that he finally issued a permanent ban on gladiatorial combat in the year 404 AD. Now, modern historians love to debate the specifics of this event. They ask, did it happen exactly like that? Did the actions of one man really shift the policy of an entire empire? In the natural, probably not. But we know that by the early 400s, the official laws effectively brought an end to the gladiatorial games in the Western Empire, marking the close of a dark chapter. The arenas didn't just shut their doors overnight, but that central industry. The organized business of trained warriors butchering each other for mass amusement began to fade into the day. However, and this is critical for you to grasp, we must understand what did not end when those bans were signed. The spirit of the thing remained. Slavery continued unabated. The sexual exploitation and trafficking of captives continued. Armies continued to use assault and rape as standard weapons of terror and subjugation. The wealthy elite still viewed the bodies of the powerless, the poor, the conquered, the darker nations as mere objects for their pleasure. What actually stopped was just a specific combination of evils. It was the state-funded blood sport in giant stadiums coupled with that organized underground system of sexual rewards that finally ceased operation. The physical machine was dismantled piece by piece, but the demonic attitudes and the spirit of Babylon that built it took much longer to die out. In fact, if you look around today, in many places, that spirit never left. Today, tourists blindly walk through the ruins of the Colosseum, snapping pictures on their phones right where emperors once sat in judgment. They peer down into the exposed hypogeum, that maze of dark passages and pits, while guides point out the elevators, the trapdoors, and the cages where they kept the beasts. Some might mention the holding cells, but very few discuss the vernatio carnalis in any real detail. The term sounds academic to the modern ear, almost sterile and harmless. But that Latin phrase conceals far more than it reveals. The reality was simple, brutal, and terrifying. Conquest turned human beings into inventory products to be used, and the arena was the distribution center that kept that wicked system running smooth. If you stood there right now in this moment, looking down from the upper levels where the Romans once cheered into the skeletal remains of the hypogeum, you might feel a sudden cold chill run down your spine. It is not because the place is haunted in the Hollywood sense. It isn't. Those stones are just dead rocks. The true horror doesn't live in the architecture. The horror lived and still lives in the choices of people who looked upon a vast machine of suffering and death and dared to call it entertainment patriotism or divine justice. I want you to think about that woman we mentioned in the opening. There is no monument built for her. History has erased her name. At some point, her body simply gave out, whether from disease, injury, or sheer exhaustion. A clerk just rubbed a line off a wax tablet and wrote another number in a different column, treating her life like a ledger entry. Her space in that dark cell was immediately filled by someone else, another victim from another war, another burned village, another stolen life. You see, the beast system didn't depend on any single victim. Its true satanic strength lay in the fact that it could replace them endlessly without blinking an eye. Think about the gladiator, the warrior, who fought for a nation that hated him. Maybe he died in that arena a few months later, pierced by a rival's blade, while the bloodthirsty crowd howled for his destruction. Or maybe he earned his freedom after surviving many victories and walked past that arena as an old man hearing the ghostly echoes of a life built entirely on the suffering of his brothers. The state used him as both a weapon of war and a billboard for their power. They rewarded him with the exact same violence they used to enslave him in the first place. And then the moment he was no longer useful to the agenda, they discarded him like trash. When we discuss Rome today, we usually focus on the shiny, visible achievements. We talk about the roads, the aqueducts, the military strategies, the legal codes, and the monumental architecture, completely ignoring the blood that cries out from the ground beneath it all. Everything you see, the statues and the stone, all of that is tangible reality, but we must look deeper than the surface. Because lurking beneath those celebrated accomplishments were demonic systems, like Victoria Carnalis, machineries of the state that transformed sexual violence into a scheduled bureaucratic activity, folded neatly into state budgets, and justified by wicked ideologies of racial superiority, conquest, and class warfare. If we choose to turn a blind eye to that darkness, we end up accepting a fantasy version of Rome, a deception that looks like a polished movie poster but bears absolutely no resemblance to the bloody truth. You have to understand, this story is not just about ancient Rome. It is a prophetic warning about what powerful states like the one we live in today do. when they start drinking their own Kool-Aid and believing their own propaganda. It is the arrogance of believing they are divinely destined to rule the earth and the dangerous lie that their enemies are somehow less than human. It is that predatory spirit which believes victory grants them the ultimate right to steal, kill, and destroy, taking whatever they desire from the oppressed. Whenever a government reduces living souls to mere numbers on a page, whenever the masses cheer while real suffering becomes a televised spectacle, and whenever violence against the powerless is treated as a perk for the elite, the demonic logic of the arena has returned. The Colosseum still stands tall today, not just as a ruin, but because it was built to last as a monument to human pride and cruelty. However, the people who suffered and died inside that beast system did not leave such solid traces. We have to hunt for their spirits in broken inscriptions, in the passing remarks of disgusted writers, and in the desperate scratch marks left on stone walls. And when we finally uncover them, they ask a quiet, haunting question that the Roman Empire never dared to answer. If you had been sitting in those stands back then, ask yourself, truly, would you have walked away when the executions began, or would you have refused the ticket to the slaughter? Or would you have stayed right there, comfortably eating your snacks and calling that abomination normal behavior? If you have walked with us through this story until now, I thank you for your courage. Most people in this world prefer the simple, sugar-coated version of history, the one with clear heroes, obvious villains, and tidy endings that do not challenge their spirit. But you chose to look at the dark reality beneath the arena, where the historical record is ugly, incomplete, and soaked in blood. If you are hungry for more hidden history like this, stories that pull back the veil on what these empires actually did, make sure you subscribe, hit the like button, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next deep dive into the truth. And do not keep this knowledge to yourself. Share this video with someone who still believes Rome was all about white marble glory and honor. They need to see what really happened in the dark after the crowd went home, because the truth must be brought to light.